Hello, my name is Julie, and today I am doing a comprehensive queer book recommendation list. I have not done a recommendation list on my YouTube channel in a while. I do quite a few of these on my Instagram, but I wanted to do a very comprehensive list where I run through just about every single queer book by a queer author that I've given 4 or 5 stars, that I generally recommend. This video is going to be very long, so I'm just going to get straight into it. The way that I have organized this is that I am separating it into 4 parts, and that is from most romantic to least romantic. So our first category is books that are romance books. These are books that are about the relationship between queer characters. The second category is kinda romance, so there is a romantic element to the book, but is not the main plot. A lot of these are coming of age books. The third category is non-romance. So these books may have a smaller side plot, but there is some sort of queer relationship somewhere in there. And the last category is zero romance, no relationship. I feel like when you talk about queer books, maybe it should be specified how much of this book is actually about the identity of the character. Maybe it just happens to be a queer character in a scenario that has nothing to do with their identity. Or maybe it is a book where it is a person who is actively coming into interaction with their identities. So that is why I wanted to organize it this way, and so you can also kind of get an idea of what the vibe of the book is in relation to its queerness. So let's start with the first category, books that are romance. I am a newbie to the romance genre, so I have fewer things in this category. The first book I'm going to talk about is the one that I've read the most recently, and that is The Charm Offensive by Alison Cochrane. This is inspired by The Bachelor, where it is now fairy tale themed, and we have one of our main characters is a producer on the show who does not have a very good track record with his love life, but he really believes in happily ever after. Our other main character is Charlie, who is a previous tech wonderkind, but then got kicked out of his own company because of his behavior, which was because of his OCD and anxiety and possible autism. And he is wanting to rebrand his image, so he is going along with the fakeness of this Bachelor show. And instead of falling in love with one of the women, he of course ends up falling in love with Dev, the producer. This was really cute. I like the representation of a possibly demisexual character, gay character, side characters that are bi, and all these identities of mental health as well. There was a lot of goofy stuff that happened with the Bachelor stuff, but I think it still had a really good heart to it. Then I'm going to talk about 2 books from the same author, and that is Casey McQuiston, who is becoming one of my favorites. The first, of course, is Red, White, and Royal Blue. This is their debut, and it is about a Prince of England falling in love with a first son of the United States and how they have to hide their relationship from the world. This was a book that was in direct response to the 2020 US election, and it was just a really fun time. I think Casey McQuiston writes really good ensemble character pieces, and this first book is no exception. And One Last Stop wasn't either. This is another romance where we have August, who has just moved from a small town to New York City, moved in with a bunch of queer people in her new apartment, and she meets this girl on the Q train who's super punk and butch. She falls in love with her, but it turns out that this girl is actually stuck in time on the Q train. She's from like the 70s or 80s, and August is desperately trying to figure out how in the world do I get the love of my life off of this train. It was really fun. I actually really liked the time travel-y mystery element a surprising amount, but I did really love the ensemble cast of this. Then I've got Delilah Green Doesn't Care by Ashley Herring Blake, another author I will talk about more later. but this is a romance about Delilah Green, who's a photographer. The only thing left of her family is her stepfamily, and she's kind of gone away from them, and her stepsister is getting married, so she comes back as she's invited to be the photographer, not a guest, and she ends up interacting with one of her stepsister's best friends, also from childhood, and they start falling for each other, but at the same time, they are trying to shut down this wedding because this guy is very clearly not good for Astrid, the stepsister. Even though Astrid hasn't always been the nicest to Delilah. I like how they both have their own arcs of trying to figure out their adult lives and also dating. I really like the photography aspect of this, and I loved the interactions between Delilah and Astrid and how they were figuring themselves out. Then we've got Written in the Stars by Alexandria Bellfleur. This is about a girl who does horoscopes and is a very creative person, social media person, and a type A lawyery business person who gets set up on a blind date that goes poorly, but because the people in their lives are so excited about them finally going out with someone, they decide to fake date throughout the holiday season and decide to break up after New Year's and get back to their lives. But of course, they end up wanting to be with each other more. While I didn't love the third act conflict with this, I did like the spice. I liked the dynamic between these two very different characters, and I liked the holiday setting. It was cute. Now we're into our kinda romance section. A lot of these are coming of age, so the romance is usually like kind of tied up in the plot, but it is not marketed as a romance. A lot of these are marketed as like contemporary. First, we have Honey Nishu's Guide to Fake Dating by Adiba Jagadar. This is a YA about Honey and Ishu, who are both Bangladeshi girls in Ireland. They go to an all-girls Catholic school, and the two of them are trying to fit themselves into boxes that they don't necessarily want to be in. Hani is friends with these white girls who aren't very accepting of her, and Ishu, she says she doesn't really care what anybody thinks of her, but that's not true when it comes to her parents, and she's trying to become head girl so that she can prove to her parents that she's not a mess up. Hani accidentally comes out as bi to her friends, and they don't believe that she's actually bi because she's never dated a girl, and Ishu needs to get in with the popular crowd so she can become head girl. So they decide to fake date, and that triggers a lot of responses from the people around them. This is why I used to read YA contemporary all the time. I loved how these two girls become a safe haven for each other, and how they're different enough that they shine a light on why the other person isn't happy with their life situation. The bullying in this book was so sad, and I think that was possibly the part that I was most invested in, getting Hani out of this situation where she's being bullied all the time. Then we've got another book from Casey McQuiston, and that is I Kissed Shara Wheeler. This is one of my favorite books that I read last year, and one of my favorite YAs of all time. This is about our main character, Chloe Green, who has hated her competitor for valedictorian in her quaint southern town forever. Chloe is proudly bi, she has two moms, she's originally from California, and she doesn't put up with a lot of the things that the southern town requires of a woman. Meanwhile, Shara is the principal's daughter. She is everything that everyone wants a girl to be, and she's beloved by everyone. But then one night, Shara ends up kissing Chloe, and then fully disappearing. So Chloe's really confused, and she ends up getting a letter from Shara leading her to further clues. It turns out that not only did Shara kiss Chloe, she also kissed Shara's current boyfriend and Shara's boy next door. And the three of them, who haven't really interacted before, who are all from very different circles, have to work together to try to figure out where Shara went. This healed me in ways I didn't know was possible. It is so funny. I think Casey McQuiston needs to start writing television and movies, because this is the type of comedy that this generation is actually into. I love our queer cast of characters. I fell in love with this audiobook, and I think you will too. I think this is the unsung hero of Casey McQuiston's books. While Shara Wheeler, I think a lot of people will love, this one is more for a specific audience, and that's Milkfed by Melissa Broader. This is about Rachel, who is a lapsed Jew, and she has inherited this eating disorder from her mother, who is constantly telling her how she should be, and has done that for her entire life. And when her therapist tells her you need to cut communication with your mom for 90 days and see how you feel, Rachel's kind of lost. And then she runs into Miriam, who is a practicing Jewish woman who is fat and loves to eat as like an activity and just has a lot of joy in her life. This shifts Rachel's life dramatically as she starts to finally allow herself to indulge in pleasure of any kind. Rachel is sometimes gross. The conversations around eating disorders are very real, and Rachel's not always a character that you can agree with. Like, you as the reader acknowledge that she is coming from a very messed up worldview and is growing as a person, and I loved seeing her journey. This was another audiobook that I loved. Then we've got When the Moon Was Ours by Anna Marie McLemore. This is a YA magical realism about two teenagers who've been friends ever since they were kids. One of them is a girl who has flowers that grow out of her wrists, and the mean girls in the town are trying to take whatever magic they think she has because of those flowers. Our other main character is a trans boy, and nobody knows that he is trans. He's been passing this whole time in this town as cis, and the mean girls are trying to out him. This was a very highly emotionally charged books. They were very high highs and low lows, and I really liked the writing style and the magic type that we see in this world. Then we have Felix Ever After. This is about our main character Felix, who is a trans boy, and he gets outed as trans at his high school, and he believes he knows who did it. So he decides to catfish that person who he thinks did it and get him to like this online persona and then blackmail him in some way. But of course, things don't go exactly as Felix planned. You know, I wasn't really sure how I was going to feel about the whole catfishing plot going in, but I think it's a little bit more of a you've got mail type situation. Then I have the stars and the blackness between them. We have two girls whose families are friends. One of them is Audra, who lives in Trinidad, and she gets caught being with another girl, and so her mother shuns her and sends her away to live with her father, who lives in Minnesota. And our other main character, Mabel, she's on the basketball team. She's starting to find out that she may be queer, and she's starting to feel not herself. As Audra is coming to Minnesota, doesn't really have anybody to talk to, they're put together to be friends, and they start a sort of platonic, sort of romantic relationship of being each other's person. This book has a lot of emotions going on. This book has to do with serious illness, and these two girls are learning more about Blackness and becoming involved with the prison system in America. There are just a lot of heavy-hitting topics, while this book is also very beautifully written. Then I have A Million Quiet Revolutions by Robin Gao. This is about teenagers in a relationship who realize together that they are trans boys and are trying to learn more about their identities, and both become interested in learning about historical figures that were possibly queer and had to hide their identities, specifically women who posed as men during the American Revolution. This has poetry in it. It has a lot of historical background about real life people that was really interesting. And these two teenagers are just trying to figure out their own identities while also trying to have their relationship together and not necessarily attaching their identity to another person. Then I have Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo. This has won so many awards. This is about our main character, who is a Chinese teenage girl in the 1950s during the Red Scare in California. She is finding out about her queer identity and starts getting a crush on a girl in her class and finds community at a lesbian bar called the Telegraph Club. But of course, identities like that were not accepted at the time, so there is a lot more fear around being able to be oneself. And we also follow other members of our main character's family, their experiences moving to America from China, and how that has played a part in their life. This is another emotional one, especially because it is historical fiction, but it does ultimately have a hopeful tone. Then we have The House in the Cerulean Sea. This is about a world in which we have people who are not human, so there are magical creatures, just happen to be in the real world, and our main character is a social worker who is assigned with checking up on orphanages to make sure that the children are being taken care of, and he ends up being sent to the most dangerous orphanage there is, where all of the children are magical and are supposed to be evil. This is just a very cute, I would say, general fiction book. It could be read by YA or adult audiences. It is just about being accepting of all types of people who are different from you. This is one of those books that just gives you all the good feelings. Now we have our non-romance category. So these books all have some sort of small romantic element, but it is far from the point of the book. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the Five Penalties series by Marina Lostetter. This is a queer norm fantasy. It's a little bit of a dystopian. There's like alchemical elements to it. The first book is semi-horror. One of the queer elements of this book is that there are 5 gods, and each of them has a different gender identity, uses different pronouns, and we see different characters in this book who are non-binary and just generally don't follow the gender binary. In this world, when people die, a mask can be imbued with part of their spirit, and whatever their greatest talent was, whether that's running or noticing something out of place or detecting if somebody's lying, that mask is imbued with that ability, and someone can wear it and use that ability. And a serial killer's mask was just stolen, and now we are following people who are trying to track down the last person who came into contact with the mask and the serial killer in the past. Speaking of queer norm fantasy, there's also The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This is a queer norm / no sexism fantasy that sort of sneaks up on you that that's what this world is. This is one of those fantasies that's kind of hard to describe because it's so far-reaching, but this book was written as a standalone. There's now a prequel that I think you can also sort of read as a standalone, but they are in the same world. There's dragons in this world, and all the different countries in this world interact with dragons differently and with magic. I loved seeing how all the different cultures interacted with these same historical figures in different ways. Very fun. And the sapphic relationship in Priory is one of my favorite relationships of all time. It's not even like a huge part of the book. Something about it is so addictive to me. Then we have They Never Learn by Lane Fargo. This is a thriller about a professor who has taken it upon herself to moonlight as a serial killer. She tracks down men who have assaulted women, kills them, makes it look like they took their own life. Suddenly there has been an investigation opening into her most recent kill, so she's trying to cover her tracks. There's also a girl at this university who realizes that she's sort of starting to fall in love with her roommate. I think this book is for you if you really liked How to Get Away with Murder. That is the vibes that I got the most from this book. And I love having an unhinged woman narrative that is about bisexual women. This was just a fun one. It's not my favorite thriller of all time, but it was really edible and cathartic. Then I have a full author spotlight. I have read every single one of their books, and all of them I have given 4 or 5 stars, and that is River Solomon. I read The Deep. This is about a race of mermaids that came about when pregnant women during the African slave trade were thrown overboard, and the children inside of them became born as a race of mermaids. One of these mermaids, every generation is given the memories of every single one of the mermaids and their ancestors, and this is deeply about generational trauma. This is such a fantastic novella. I traditionally don't really love very short books, but I think this did a perfect job accomplishing what it set out to do. Then there's An Unkindness of Ghosts, which is about a generation ship that is taking humanity away from Earth. It is no longer habitable, and the ship is now set up sort of like the antebellum South, and our main character, who is trans and autistic, is a medic and trying to survive. Essentially, Black people are slaves again, or at least indentured servants on this ship, and our main character is trying to take it down as she's learning more about her mother who passed away. Seriously, very unique science fiction. And my favorite of Solomon's, that is CERULEAN. This was one of my favorite books that I read last year. This is about our main character, Vern, who was raised in a cult that was surrounding Black power, but it actually became a very toxic place to live in, as most cults are. And she ends up escaping at 15, heavily pregnant, and runs into the woods and decides to raise her children away from society, away from other people, and apart from any idea of gender. She starts to notice all of these changes that are happening to her body that don't really make a lot of sense. Then she falls ill, and she has to re-enter regular society, and she has a lot of trust issues around people. We don't really follow a linear timeline as Vern is reflecting on her time in the cult and a friend that she had at the time who she is trying to find. This is one of the most creative books I've ever read. It is fantastic from beginning to end. I was transported into Vern's perspective, and I loved seeing her interact with every person, seeing her interact with her children and how much she loves them, and seeing her try to trust people again. If you like Toni Morrison or Octavia Butler, I think River Solomon is their modern equivalent. Then we have another novella that's horror, and that is Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke by Erica LaRocca, who writes a bunch of queer horror, and it's about 2 queer women who meet in a chat room at the beginning of the internet and start sort of having a relationship that escalates very quickly. This book is really gross and was not the type of horror that I was expecting it to be, but I still think it was really effective and has a commentary about queer people and how the internet became a safe haven for them, which then allowed them to be taken advantage of. Then we have twin books that I talked about in my last video, and that is She Who Became the Sun and Iron Widow. Both of these books are beginnings of duologies that are inspired by Wu Zetian, who was China's first and only female emperor. I'll talk about She Who Became the Sun first. This is about Zhu, who, when they were young, her brother was destined for greatness and she was destined for nothingness, but a drought and plague crosses the nation and her entire family dies, and she decides to take her brother's identity and goes to the monastery that he was promised to go to and gathers more political and magical power. And this is just a really thought-provoking fantasy with interesting characters. Zhu's relationship with Ma is one of my favorite parts. Ma is my favorite character in this book by a long shot, and I just cannot wait to see how this plays out in book 2. And then Iron Widow is about Zetian. Aliens are constantly invading Earth, and the way that we are fighting against them is with giant mechs, like in Pacific Rim and several different animes. To pilot it, a boy and a girl have to pilot the ship, but the boy's chi, when fighting, almost always overpowers the girls and kills her in the very first fight. And Zetian's sister is one of these girls who was conscripted to just die immediately. And so Zetian decides that she is going to get revenge not only on the boy who was specifically responsible for her sister's death, but the system that allowed this to happen. There is so much gender commentary in both of these books, and I love the queer relationships in both of them to the ends of this earth. I cannot wait to finish both of these duologies. Then we actually have a creative nonfiction, and that is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This is about Machado's toxic relationships, specifically with a woman that she was married to, and how queer relationships are not allowed by society to be perceived as toxic. If a queer relationship is toxic, then that is proof of why queer people shouldn't be allowed to have rights. That sort of thing. And the writing in this book is so beautiful. The author's story is heartbreaking and it hurts so much, and it was sadly something that I could relate to sometimes. This was just one of the most impactful nonfictions I have ever read. I do not read memoirs, and if you don't either, I still highly encourage you to read this. It is a good amount of the author's specific experience and learning about the history of queerness and how it has not been accepted by the general public. Then we have Ace of Spades, which I read with my book club, 3 of Clubs. This is about a private school where there are only 2 Black students in the entire school. They're both in their senior year, and they both, for some reason, are selected to be head boy and girl. And there starts to be messages that are being sent to them that are blackmailing them, that are being sent out to the entire student body, setting them up for things that they didn't actually do. These 2 Black teenagers who never really interacted with each other are forced to work together to try to figure out who is trying to take them down. These characters are also both queer, and I really liked the conversations that were had with the relationships that they had, because I think there was a lot of purpose in which they were done. This is one of the best YA books I've ever read. It is so, I think that it should be considered general fiction because I think more adults need to read this book. Then we have Plain Bad Heroines, which has several layers to it. Back in the 1800s, there was a school for girls that was very queer, and there were several students that died that ended up getting the school shut down. And then there is a book that's a woman wrote about the real life people who went to that school, and now there is a movie adaptation of that book being made, and we follow the teachers at the school who are queer women and their relationships, and the teenagers at the school who are queer women, and the queer author of this book, and the queer women who are going to be actors in this movie, all who are having weird hauntings happening around the adaptation of this movie. This book is really long. It is slow, kind of horror, but I think it ultimately pays off. And honestly, the relationship between the 3 modern women was like my favorite part of the book. Then we have On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. This is a semi-autobiographical book that is fiction, and it is about Little Dog who is writing letters to his mother who cannot read English, and sort of explaining their relationship. This has to do a lot with intergenerational trauma, and also Little Dog trying to be accepted as both a Vietnamese person and as a queer person. This is one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read. Ocean Vuong is a poet, so that makes a lot of sense. Very popular book for a good reason. Then we have A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. This is about 4 friends throughout the years, specifically centered around Jude, who has a very traumatic past and is attempting to get past it. This is a very chunky book. I read it in a vlog a long time ago. This is one of the most emotionally charged books I've ever read, but also one of the most purposefully written. One of the things that I've learned that I love is when the form of a book follows the story itself. There are a lot of very small literary elements that are used to reflect how characters view themselves. And I think that this was just a perfectly crafted book, even if it is very, very sad. Then we have We Are the Ants by Sean David Hutchinson, one of my favorite YAs of all time, one of my favorite books of all time, one of my favorite covers of all time. So freaking good. Our main character, Henry, is having the worst year of his life. His boyfriend recently took his own life. His grandmother is losing his memory. His family is struggling for money, and he doesn't feel like taking it anymore. And then he repeatedly gets abducted by aliens, and these aliens eventually tell him that they're going to end the world in 144 days, unless he presses a button and stops it. And it is Henry deciding over the course of this 144 days if he even wants to press the button. I love the speculative element of it. I think this is Sean David Hutchinson's best book. I've read almost all of them, and this one is the best executed in the way that the speculative element is a metaphor for all of the things that the main character is going through. Then we have We Are Okay by Nina LaCour. I also recommend, this is about our main character who ran away from her life in California, away from her best friend of many years and her grandfather after something happened, and ran off to her New England university and has shuttered herself away from the world. This book takes place during her winter break after her first semester, as her best friend is coming to visit her and try to figure out what happened. This perfectly encapsulates loneliness, specifically loneliness at university. I read this at a time where I was like at my lowest and in university, so this had a really big impact on me personally. We'll do another hard-hitting one next, and that is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. This is another one of my favorite books of all time, one of the great American novels for a good reason. This follows our main character, Celie, who is a Black girl and then woman at the beginning of the 1900s. She lives in a southern Black community and is being abused by several people around her, and she is desperately trying to hold on and find value in herself, and this is her journey of how it happens. It is written in her letters to God, and it is so emotionally impactful. Celie's journey is one of the best written of all time. If you haven't read this book, I implore you to, although I do think that you should check out the trigger warnings because this is a very difficult read, particularly at the beginning, but I do think it gets easier as you go. Another hard-hitting one, that is Girl Made of Stars by Ashley Herring Blake, who I mentioned before. She used to write only YA books, but this is about our main character, Mara, who is a twin, is as close as she can possibly be with her twin Owen, but then Owen is accused by his girlfriend, who is also Mara's friend, of rape, and it absolutely shatters the friend group and the family and Mara's own perception of her family and her twin brother. And she is battling between her own identities and her own sense of right and wrong. And it also sucks that her longtime best friend turned girlfriend turned ex-girlfriend and her are not on good terms at the moment. This is a fantastic book. I teared up or cried every single time I opened this book. It talks about the trauma of assault from a lot of different perspectives. We only follow Mara's, but we get conversations with all these different characters, and it is always believing the victim, which I thought was fantastic. Then we have An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. Yes, Hank Green is queer. Let's go. This is the beginning of a duology about our main character, April May, who is just walking home one day, runs across this really weird statue in New York, and just decides to make a goofy video interviewing it, calling it a Carl. And it turns out that these statues, these giant Samurai-looking statues suddenly appeared overnight in countries across the world with no rhyme or reason, and the world kind of goes into a little bit of chaos about it, and April May finds herself as the spokesperson for these statues. And there's a little bit of almost like a treasure hunt element of her trying to figure out what is the deal with these Carls. This is a really fun duology that also has a lot of creative science fiction elements to it, and it is ultimately a commentary on the social internet as a whole, and it is from one of the people who knows it best. Highly recommend this book series, and I think it is absolutely not read enough. It's also absolutely remarkable. I'm hilarious. Then we have The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. This is about a world in which we have figured out how to go between the most similar parallel worlds to ours. But the thing is, you can only travel if your double on the other world is dead. We're in this utopian city that is founded upon these principles, but our main character, Carmen, is from the slums in this desert, but she is employed by this rich city because she's a very useful jumper. There are only 8 of her alive out of the entirety of all these parallel universes, but now there are only 7, and she's going to figure out why that is. One of the most fun books I've ever read. So many twists and turns. I love the commentary on classism, and the relationship, while it's not a large part of the book, is also very cute, and the love interest is inspired by Mr. Darcy. Then we have The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Niveau. This is the first book in the Singing Hill cycle, which is a series of connected novellas that can be read in any order about Chi, who is a monk who is in charge of writing down stories from other people. They are supposed to collect as many histories as they can. And in this story specifically, Chi is talking to Rabbit, who used to be the handmaiden of a previous empress. So we are following the story of their relationship. This is so fairy tale-esque, and it'll only take you like 1 or 2 sittings to finish. Then we have Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. This is such an impactful YA book. I listened to this audiobook in 1 sitting on a plane. And this is about Frances, who is going into her last year of high school. She's obsessed with this fiction podcast, and she does fan art for it. And the person actually reaches out and wants her to work with the show. And it turns out it is a guy who goes to her school. And they form a deep friendship that always stays platonic, and are each having their own struggles about school and their family and their queer identities, and it is just so emotional and ultimately heartwarming book. Then we have The 5th Season by N.K. Jemisin. This series has won the Hugo and the Nebula Award, broke a bunch of records for it. The world has had so many catastrophic events happen that natural disasters are just part of the seasons, and humanity has to keep going into hiding, and society keeps crumbling because of this. There are now people who can sort of interact with the Earth's tremors, and that causes some problems. And in the first book, we are following 3 different perspectives, girls and women who are at different points in their life trying to interact with this society. Then we have the last book I finished, and that is I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself by Marissa Crane. Prisons have been abolished, but instead, criminals or anybody who's like considered unsavory are given a literal second shadow, but they are just marked as unsavory people and are systematically discriminated against. And our main character was given a second shadow a while ago. We don't know why. And her wife really wanted a child. She got pregnant, but then ended up dying in childbirth, and now is having to take care of the child that her wife wanted. And this child has been given a second shadow for killing her mother. This was such a great audiobook. I do think this is another weird protagonist that is sort of in the style of Milk-Fed. I really loved it. This has got to be by far my favorite 2023 release that I've read this year so far. In our very last section, I'm going to go fast, is the no romance at all. The first is A Psalm for the Wild-Built by Becky Chambers. This is about a world in which robots ended up gaining sentience and decided that they didn't want to do what humanity wanted them to do, so they just fucked off. They haven't interacted with humans in generations. But our main character is a tea monk, and they have kind of become unsatisfied with their job, so they ended up going into the wilderness to just do a little journey by themselves, and they ended up running into a robot, and the two of them have a cultural exchange and learn a lot more about what it means to be a being. Very cute. Therapy in a book. Can't wait to read more of these novellas. Then we have Don't Cry for Me by Daniel Black. This is another kind of semi-autobiographical fiction book. So our main character is an old man who's dying of cancer, and he is writing letters to his son about the entirety of his life, the good parts and the very, very awful parts, and not trying to give an excuse for the terrible way that he treated his gay son, but give an explanation of where he came from and how he did change over the course of his life and heal more, but he can never bridge the gap because he was instilled with such a strong image of what a Black man should be that he could never really apologize and connect with his son. Fantastic audiobook. Made me want to cry so many times. Then we have Pet. This is a very short YA general fiction book. It is for younger readers, but I think it could be read by anybody. And this is a world in which monsters have been entirely eliminated and angels are ones that protect everyone. And there is a creature that our main character, Jam, pulls from a painting, who tells Jam that there is a monster living in her best friend's house, and the two of them have to track down and find this monster so a person can stop being hurt. This is for younger readers to learn more about terrible people who do bad things to children, but also about how sometimes adults don't want to accept that something bad is happening and sort of sweep it under the rug, but has a very positive ending. Then we have What Moves Dead by T. Kingfisher. This is a retelling and expansion of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. This is sort of fantasy horror. Our main character is non-binary and is coming to the aid of a person from their past as this friend's sister is dying. A lot of creepy stuff that happens, but I think this is the perfect retelling because this original story is so short and could have been longer, and I think that this does a perfect job expanding upon it. And the last book I'm going to talk about is The Future of Another Timeline by Annalee Newitz. This is about a world in which humanity has always had time travel and the timeline is always getting edited. So we have two perspectives that we follow. One of them is Beth, who in the 80s, her and her friends end up accidentally murdering a boy who assaulted their friend, and they are trying to cover up their tracks. And in 2022, Tess is a professional time traveler who is figuring out that women's rights, reproductive rights, queer people's rights, rights of people of color are being slowly edited away by different organizations, and she is doing her best to fix them. Time travel is my favorite trope. This is one of the most original takes of time travel I have ever read, and one of the most actively activist books I've ever read. I love how this book handled everything it talked about. I think some of the plot twists were predictable, but ultimately the creativity and the themes that went into this made it so special. Now that it's dark, those are all of the queer books that I have to recommend to you today. Please let me know if you've read any of these, any books you recommend me. As always, my link is in the description if you'd like to follow me anywhere on my Instagram, whatever I do. And thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.